What would you do if the key to your family's redemption was hidden in plain sight, dismissed as the foolish purchase of a grieving girl? Imagine acquiring a place everyone in the world called a tomb, a dusty, forgotten bookshop on a cobbled Edinburgh close, bought for the last few shillings in your purse. They said it was a grave for your money, final foolish gesture of a life already in ruins. But the truth waiting inside, pressed between the pages of forgotten books, was a secret that could restore a family's name and a city's hope. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. This is the story of Emily Dawson and the inheritance she found not in a will, but in the quiet, patient weight of paper and ink. The autumn of 1862 arrived in Edinburgh on a tide of damp grey mist, clinging to the stone tenements and swallowing the cries of gulls over the firth of Forth. It was to this city of shadows and whispers that Emily Dawson returned, not in triumph, but in a quiet, profound defeat. At 21, she possessed a face that had once been praised for its bright intelligence, but was now pale and drawn, her grey eyes holding the deep, still water of a grief too new to have settled. She stepped down from the coach at the Grassmarket, her worn woolen dress and mended boots a stark contrast to the fashionable ladies stepping into their carriages. In her hand she clutched a small, worn leather reticule containing the entirety of her worldly inheritance, a handful of sovereigns and the heavy, invisible burden of her father's ruin. He had been a man of letters and quiet integrity, a well-regarded broker, whose trust in the burgeoning promise of the city's merchant banks had been absolute, until it wasn't. She remembered the progression of his despair as if it were etched onto her own heart. First, the strained silence at the dinner table, then the long nights spent hunched over ledgers under a single candle, his pen scratching with a frantic energy. Then came the day the letters for Finch and merchant bankers stopped arriving, and a chilling quiet descended upon their once comfortable home. His business, built on handshakes and good faith, had evaporated like morning har. They broke their word, Emily, he had whispered in his final weeks, his eyes fixed on some distant point of betrayal she could not see. They simply broke their word. His ruin was not a matter of poor judgment, but of a promise turned to smoke. He had withered, a great oak poisoned at the root, and now he was gone, leaving her with nothing but a name whispered with pity and the lingering question of his final words. She had one destination, a small, derelict property tucked away in a narrow, winding alley off the Royal Mile, a place her father had once pointed out on a happier walk years ago. Old Carstairs' bookshop, he'd said with a sad smile. A man who loved books more than bread. The place has been shuttered since he passed. It had been for sale for years, an unmovable fixture of decay, its windows so coated in grime they were nearly opaque. To the world it was an eyesore. To Emily, it was the only piece of ground she could afford to stand on. She had used nearly all her money to purchase the deed, a transaction met with bewildered pity by the solicitor's clerk. Now she stood before it, the cold iron key heavy in her palm. The sign, barely legible, read Carstairs Books, Est, 1798. The paint was a ghost of its former self. This was her inheritance, a tomb of paper, a monument of dust, and as the damp cold seeped through her thin coat, she felt a flicker not of hope, but of grim, unyielding determination. She would not wither as her father had. She would stand here. The key grated in the lock, a sound of rust and long disuse that echoed in the preternatural quiet of the close. Emily pushed, her shoulder pressed against the heavy oak. The door groaned open, releasing a sigh of air thick with the scent of decaying paper, leather, and a profound, undisturbed stillness. Dust motes, ancient and thick as snowfall, danced in the single beam of weak afternoon light that pierced the gloom. Books were everywhere, not merely on shelves, but in teetering stacks that rose from the floor like petrified trees. They spilled from crates, lay open on counters, and formed precarious hills in every corner. It was less a shop and more the site of a literary avalanche, frozen in time. The scale of the neglect was overwhelming, a physical manifestation of hopelessness that threatened to suffocate her own fragile resolve. Her heart sank. The whispers she'd overheard had been right. This was a grave. A familiar voice broke the silence. "Miss Dawson? Emily?" Mr. McLeod, the kindly carter, who had known her family for years, stood behind her, holding the single battered trunk that contained all she had left. He was the only soul from her past who had not looked at her with pity, but with a quiet paternal concern. He peered into the gloom, his brow furrowed. "Good heavens, child, it's worse than I imagined." He set the trunk down just inside the door, his presence a small, warm anchor in the cold, dead space. "Are you certain about this?" he asked, his voice gentle. "It is all I have, Mr. McLeod," Emily replied, her own voice sounding small and thin in the vast, silent room. He nodded slowly, understanding the finality in her tone. He passed her a small package wrapped in brown paper. "My wife sent a loaf and some cheese. You must eat." He hesitated, his hand on the door. "If you need anything, anything at all, you send word." And then he was gone, leaving her truly alone with her folly. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, not cleaning, not organizing, but simply walking the narrow paths between the towers of books, touching their spines. She found a small, cot-like room at the back, containing little more than a rickety table and a chair. This must have been where old Mr. Carstairs had spent his days. The sheer volume of knowledge, of stories, of lives bound in leather and cloth, was dizzying. Each book was a silent witness. But to what? Her purchase felt more foolish by the minute, a desperate grasp at a place to belong that seemed determined to reject her. As dusk fell, she sat on her trunk, the untouched loaf in her lap, and watched the darkness consume the last of the light, feeling the weight of every sovereign she had spent. Had she just buried herself alive? Was this a grave for her last few shillings, or a tomb holding a secret? What would you have done in her place, faced with such a daunting and lonely task? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage. For Emily, the choice was already made, and as the old building settled around her with a series of creaks and groans, she felt the first stirrings of a strange thought. The shop was beginning to speak. The following morning, Emily began her work. Armed with a broom purchased with one of her few remaining coins, she attacked the thickest layers of dust on the floorboards. The simple, repetitive motion was a balm, a physical act to counter the swirling chaos in her mind. As she swept, the shuttered life of the close began to stir outside. Faces peered through the grimy windows, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and amusement. Children pointed. Women, on their way to the market, stopped to whisper to one another, their words lost to her, but their meaning clear in their dismissive glances. The news of the mad girl who had bought Carstairs' folly had already made its rounds. Around midday, a shadow fell across the doorway. A man stood there, tall and impeccably dressed, his polished boots gleaming even in the dim light. He had a florid face and an air of supreme self-satisfaction. Emily recognized him instantly. Mr. Alistair Finch, the son of the man who had founded Finch and Sons, and the current head of the firm. He did not enter, but leaned against the doorframe, a smirk playing on his lips. "Well, well," he said, his voice loud and carrying. "Miss Dawson, is it? I heard a rumor, but I confess I didn't believe it." He cast a contemptuous eye over the chaotic interior. A girl playing shopkeeper in a crypt, a brave, if profoundly misguided, venture. Emily's hands tightened on the broom handle. She said nothing, her silence a thin shield against his condescension. "My father had dealings with yours, you know," Finch continued, enjoying his audience of passers-by. "A terrible shame, his end. A lesson in the perils of poor judgment, I suppose. It seems the apple doesn't fall far from the tree." He laughed, a short, barking sound that echoed in the dusty space. I'll give you a week before you're begging someone to take this ruin off your hands." With a final, pitying shake of his head, he turned and walked away, his laughter lingering in the air. Each word was a small, sharp stone thrown at the fragile edifice of her composure. The sting of his mockery was still fresh when another visitor appeared late in the afternoon. This man was the opposite of Finch in every way. He was old and stooped, with a kind, weary face and hands permanently stained with the ghost of black ink. He introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy, a retired printer who had worked on a nearby wind for 50 years. He had known Mr. Carstairs. He didn't look at the mess with disdain, but with a sort of reverence. His eyes scanned the shelves, the stacks, the sheer, overwhelming presence of the books. He was a good man. "Old Carstairs," Mr. Abernathy murmured, his voice raspy with age. "Not a businessman. Never was." He looked directly at Emily, his gaze sharp and surprisingly lucid. He seemed to be weighing her, measuring her purpose. Then he delivered a single, cryptic statement. "Old Carstairs never cared for money," he said slowly, his eyes drifting to a shelf of heavy, leather-bound folios. "He cared for what was bound." He gave a slight, formal bow of his head and departed as quietly as he had arrived, leaving Emily standing in a cloud of dust and confusion. What was bound? The words hung in the air, nonsensical. Did he mean the bindings of the books themselves, or something more? The weight of the day settled on her. Finch's public scorn, the whispers of the town, and now this old man's strange pronouncement. She felt more alone than ever, an island in a sea of disapproval. That night, sleep offered little respite, as the printer's words echoed in her dreams. What was bound? That evening, Emily made a decision. She could not afford a separate lodging, and the thought of leaving the shop to the darkness and its ghosts felt like a surrender. With a resolve born of necessity, she hauled her trunk up a narrow, creaking staircase at the back of the shop. It led to a single small room, colder and damper than the space below. It held a small fireplace choked with ancient soot, a narrow bed frame with a rotted mattress, and a single window that looked out onto a wall of blackened stone. This would be her home. She dragged her father's old wingback chair, the one piece of furniture she had insisted on keeping, up the stairs. It was an arduous, clumsy process, the chair's bulk scraping against the narrow walls. But when it was finally settled by the cold hearth, it was an anchor of familiarity in this strange new world. She spent her first night there, wrapped in her traveling cloak on the bare bed frame, listening. The building was alive with sound, the groan of old timber, the whisper of wind finding its way through cracks in the window frame, the distant, mournful cry of a ship's horn from the port of Leith. It was not a frightening sound, but a companionable one. The bookshop felt less like a tomb now, and more like a great, sleeping creature, its breath the slow settling of dust, its dreams the millions of words held silent in the dark below. She felt a strange sense of being watched over, not by a ghost, but by the sheer collective weight of the stories she now owned. The next morning, she descended the stairs not as a proprietor inspecting her failed investment, but as an inhabitant. The light, slanting through the one clean patch she'd wiped on the front window, was different. It was soft, hallowed, illuminating the columns of books as if they were pillars in a forgotten cathedral. She ran her hand along a row of calfskin spines, feeling the raised bands, the brittle gold leaf of the titles. A connection was forming, a tactile understanding that went beyond ownership. This was not just a place of business. It was a sanctuary, and she was its new keeper. As she moved deeper into the shop's labyrinthine aisles, a flicker of movement caught her eye. Behind a formidable stack of folio volumes on theology, two green eyes blinked at her from the shadows. She stopped, holding her breath. A cat, painfully thin and the color of ginger marmalade, stared back at her, poised to flee. It was as much a forgotten relic as the books surrounding it. Instead of trying to catch it, Emily slowly backed away. She went to her small store of provisions and poured a little of her milk into a chipped saucer she'd found on a shelf. She placed it on the floor, a good 10 feet from the cat's hiding place, and then returned to her work at the front of the shop, making no sudden moves. An hour passed, then another. When she glanced back, the saucer was empty. The cat remained in the shadows, but it was watching her, its gaze no longer fearful, but appraising. A silent pact had been offered and accepted. She was no longer entirely alone. The day ended not with despair, but with the quiet companionship of a stray cat and the feeling that she had finally truly come home. Days turned into a week, and Emily's life found a new quiet rhythm. Morning was for cleaning, for letting in the thin northern light and waging a gentle war against the accumulated grime of decades. Afternoons were for sorting. She began the colossal task of trying to impose some order on the chaos, designating sections for history, poetry, science, and law. It was during this process, her hands dusty and her mind absorbed, that she first encountered the anomaly. She was clearing a low shelf of legal texts, heavy volumes bound in dark, unforgiving leather. She picked one up, a thick commentary on Scottish property law, and it felt wrong. It was heavier than its size suggested, and strangely rigid, as if it had absorbed the damp and frozen solid. She carried it to the small clearing she had made for a desk, the old counter where Mr. Carstairs must have sat. She opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed and smelled of time itself. As she fanned through them, she noticed one page, right in the center of the book, that did not behave like the others. It was stiff. It refused to bend with the same supple grace as its neighbors. When she held it flat, it lay perfectly, unnaturally smooth. Curious, she held the page up to the light of her candle. It was thicker than the rest, and she could just make out a faint, rectangular shadow within the paper itself. Something with sharp lines and the ghost of printed text that was not part of the book's own printing. It was as if two pages had been fused together with something trapped inside. Her first thought was practical, a binder's error, perhaps a damp press accident from long ago that had caused the pages to weld together. It was an old book full of imperfections. She was about to dismiss it, to place the heavy volume on the law stack and move on. But she hesitated. The memory of Mr. Abernathy's words surfaced unbidden. He cared for what was bound. She ran her thumb over the stiff page. It felt intentional, deliberate. She set the book aside on her desk, separate from the others, a quiet question mark in her day's labor. Later that afternoon, while sorting through a pile of slim poetry anthologies, she found another, a collection of verse by minor romantic poets, a book of no particular value. Yet there it was again, a single, thick, unyielding page. This time the shadow within was smaller, more square. She placed this book next to the law volume on her desk. She did not try to open them. Not yet. The discovery was too fragile, too uncertain. It felt like holding her breath. Acting on it felt like a trespass. For now she would simply observe. The ginger cat, whom she had decided to call Ink, hopped silently onto the desk. After a moment of consideration, he curled up directly beside the heavy law volume. His tail tucked neatly around his paws and began to purr, a low rumble in the quiet shop. He seemed to be guarding it. That evening, Emily sat in her father's chair, staring at the two books on the counter below, a strange and potent curiosity stirring in the place where despair had so recently lived. The shop was speaking, and she was finally beginning to learn its language. The small pile of anomalous books on her desk became a silent obsession. The act of cleaning the shop was no longer a chore, but an investigation. Each book she picked up was a potential clue. She developed a second sense, her fingers learning to detect the subtle, unnatural rigidity that betrayed a hidden secret. With a soft brush and a damp cloth, she worked her way through the shelves, her movements methodical and patient. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and stained with ink and dust, but they were learning. They learned the dry crackle of a 17th-century Bible, the smooth coolness of a modern philosophical treatise, and the telltale stiffness of a page that held more than just words. The pile grew: a book on botany, a travelogue of the Grand Tour, a tattered copy of the Pilgrim's Progress. By the end of the second week, she had set aside 17 volumes. They were all different in subject, size, and age, connected only by this single shared peculiarity. As she worked, ink was her constant silent shadow. He would sleep on a stack of sorted histories, his ginger fur a warm patch of color in the gray gloom, or bat playfully at a loose thread on an ancient tapestry binding. His quiet, self-sufficient presence was a comfort, a living heartbeat in the house of sleeping words. One afternoon, a memory surfaced, triggered by the smell of crumbling leather. She saw her father at his desk, not the despairing man of his final year, but the vibrant scholar of her childhood. He was teaching her how to rebind a damaged book, his large, gentle hands showing her how to sew the signatures, how to work the glue into the spine. "You must respect the material, Emily," he had said, his voice warm with passion. "Paper has a memory. You listen to it." She was listening now, with an intensity that bordered on reverence. She felt a profound connection to the shop's mysterious former owner, Mr. Carstairs. This was not a random act of a madman. This was a system, a craft. He had used his own skills, the very tools of his trade, to create a library of secrets. Her search yielded another discovery. Tucked away on a high shelf, covered in a thick shroud of cobwebs, was a small, leather-bound folio. It was locked with a small, tarnished brass clasp. On the cover, embossed in faded gold leaf, was a single name: A. Carstairs. There was no key. She tried to pry it open, but the lock was sturdy. It resisted, guarding its contents as stubbornly as the books guarded theirs. She placed the locked folio on the desk beside the growing pile of stiff-paged volumes. The evidence was compounding, solidifying from a mere curiosity into a tangible mystery. The shop was a puzzle box, and she was slowly, painstakingly gathering the pieces. That evening, she did not retreat upstairs to her cold room immediately. She sat on the floor of the shop, ink purring in her lap, and simply looked at the collection she had assembled. 17 books and a locked journal. The question was no longer if there was a secret, but what she would do when she finally brought it into the light. Her thumb pressed against the rigid page of a book on celestial navigation. The decision was made. It was time to see what was bound inside. The moment had come. The shop was quiet, the door bolted against the encroaching dusk. A single candle flickered on the counter, casting long, dancing shadows. Emily chose the first book she had found, the heavy volume of Scottish law. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the profound silence of the room. She took a deep breath, her father's words echoing in her mind. Listen to it. From the small wooden box of his bookbinding tools, she selected a thin, flexible palette knife, its blade worn smooth with age. It felt familiar and right in her hand. With the utmost care, she slid the tip of the knife into the almost invisible seam at the top of the fused page. She didn't push or force it. She let the weight of the knife do the work, gently rocking it back and forth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a faint, dry whisper, the glue began to give way. The paper parted. Slowly, painstakingly, she worked her way down the edge of the page. It felt like performing surgery, a delicate operation on the body of the book itself. Finally, the page split open, revealing a hidden cavity. And inside, pressed flat and perfectly preserved, was not a dried flower or a sentimental note. It was a bearer bond, issued by the Royal Bank of Scotland, for the sum of £500. Emily stared at it, her hand trembling so violently she had to set the knife down. £500. It was a fortune, more money than she had seen in her entire life. It was enough to live on for years. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her mind reeled. This couldn't be real. It was a dream, a fantasy conjured by a lonely, desperate girl in a dusty room. But the bond was solid in her hands, the paper crisp, the ink stark and official. Galvanized, she reached for the next book, the slim poetry anthology. Her movements were faster now, more certain. The page split more easily this time. Inside was another bond, for a smaller amount, but also something else. A folded letter, the paper thin as onion skin. She unfolded it with shaking fingers. The letterhead was stark and familiar, sending a chill through her. Finch and Sons, merchant bankers. The letter was handwritten, dated from the year of the great market panic, the year her father's fortunes had turned. It was addressed to Mr. A. Carstairs. She began to read. "My dear Carstairs," it began, the script elegant and precise. "In light of the present instability, I have taken the liberty of securing the principal of several key accounts beyond the reach of the current panic. I entrust them to your unimpeachable discretion. Please hold them in trust, off ledger, until such time as confidence is restored. Their owners believe the funds lost. It is better this way, to avoid a run. We will see them made whole when the time is right." And then she saw it. A list of names, the Murrays, the Sinclairs, the McGregors, and last, at the bottom of the list, a name that made her gasp. Dawson. Her father's name. The truth crashed down upon her with the force of a physical blow. Finch's bank hadn't lost the money. They hadn't been victims of a collapse. They had hidden it. Fearing a bank run, the elder Mr. Finch had secretly removed his most important client's capital, and, with the help of his trusted friend, the reclusive bookseller, had concealed it. He had let his clients, his friends, his neighbors, believe they were ruined, all to protect the foundations of his own firm. Carstairs, the man who loved what was bound, had bound their salvation into the very fabric of his books, creating a secret paper bank. Emily sank onto a stool, the letter in her hand, surrounded by the quiet, explosive truth. The shop was not a tomb. It was an ark. A fierce autumn gale descended upon Edinburgh, a howling fury of wind and rain that rattled the window frames and sent water streaming down the ancient stones of the close. Inside the shop, Emily worked by candlelight. The bonds and letters spread across the counter like a map to a buried world. She had opened every one of the 17 books, and each had yielded its treasure. The total sum was staggering, enough to restore not just her own family's name, but the fortunes of half a dozen others. Just as she was carefully gathering the documents, a violent banging shook the front door. It wasn't the wind, it was a fist. "Miss Dawson, open this door." The voice was unmistakable, sharp and imperious, even through the thick oak. Alistair Finch. Panic seized her. She quickly swept the bonds and letters into a drawer. "What do you want?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "I've come to make you an offer," he shouted over the storm. "I've heard you're making a go of this place. I'll take it off your hands. A generous offer, more than it's worth, before you ruin yourself completely as your father did." He was trying the handle, rattling the door in its frame. He wanted to get in. He wanted to see what she had. A cold dread washed over her. Did he know? Or was this just his usual predatory arrogance? She stood frozen, her hand on the drawer. Just as she was about to refuse him again, another, more desperate sound reached her. A woman's cry and the wail of a baby. Peering through a clean patch on the window, she saw a young family, a man, a woman clutching an infant, huddled in the small alcove of her doorway, trying to shelter from the driving rain. Their faces were etched with exhaustion and despair. In that instant, Emily made a choice. This was not about her. It was not about her fortune or her revenge. It was about the names on those letters. She strode to the door, unlocked it, and pulled it open just wide enough to address the family. "Come in," she said, her voice firm and clear. "Get out of the storm." She ushered them inside, past a stunned and furious Alistair Finch, and then barred the door firmly in his face. The family, who introduced themselves as the Murrays, looked around the book-filled room with wide, lost eyes. We have nowhere to go," the young man stammered. "We were put out of our rooms this morning. Everything we had was with Finch's bank. Emily's heart ached. Murray. The name was on one of the letters. She looked from their desperate faces to the drawer holding their salvation. She did not show them the bond. Not yet. Instead, she led them to the back, stirred the embers in the small hearth, and put a kettle on to boil. She shared the last of her bread and cheese. She gave the mother her own cloak to wrap the baby in. She spent the night not as a newfound heiress, but as a quiet caretaker, her own discovery, taking a back seat to the immediate human need in front of her. She had committed not to wealth, but to justice. As the storm raged outside, she sat in her father's chair, holding the sleeping Murray baby, her resolve as solid and unshakable as the castle rock overlooking the city. The storm passed with the night, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under a pale morning sun. Emily left the sleeping Murray family in the warmth of the back room and, with a single bond and its corresponding letter tucked securely inside her dress, she walked to the offices of Mr. Thompson, a solicitor known throughout the city for his quiet demeanor and unbending integrity. He was an old man with eyes that had seen the spectrum of human folly and virtue, and he received her with a calm, courteous attention that was a balm after Finch's blustering. Wordlessly, Emily placed the bond and the letter from the elder Mr. Finch on his polished mahogany desk. Mr. Thompson picked them up, his expression neutral. He read the letter first, his eyebrows rising almost imperceptibly. He read it a second time. Then he examined the bond, holding it to the light, running a practiced thumb over the embossed seal and the watermarked paper. The silence in the room stretched, thick with consequence. Finally, he lowered the documents to the desk and looked at Emily, a new respect dawning in his old eyes. "Miss Dawson," he said, his voice low and grave, "these are genuine. The bond is perfectly valid. And this letter is an admission of trust. Where did you find them?" Emily told him everything. The purchase of the shop, the strange stiffness of the pages, the discovery. He listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "Old man Carstairs," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He was a far deeper man than anyone knew. He stood up. "Leave this with me, Miss Dawson. I will handle Mr. Finch, and I will begin contacting the other families. Go back to your shop. You have done a great and courageous thing." The effect of that single meeting was like a stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples spread through the narrow closes and grand squares of Edinburgh with astonishing speed. Mr. Thompson was as good as his word. Alistair Finch was summoned to the solicitor's office that very afternoon. He was seen entering with his usual swagger, but he emerged an hour later pale and visibly shrunken, refusing to meet the eyes of anyone he passed. There was no public scandal, no trial in the papers. Mr. Thompson, in his wisdom, orchestrated it all with quiet, surgical precision. It was a matter of honor, he insisted, and the honor of the city's commerce depended on it being set right without fanfare. One by one, the families named in Carstairs' hidden library were called to the solicitor's office. They entered with faces of weary disbelief and left with tears of stunned, life-altering joy. The whispers in the close outside Emily's shop began to change. Mockery turned to curiosity, and curiosity to a hushed, burgeoning awe. The story, in its simple, powerful truth, was too remarkable to be contained. People began to walk by not to stare at the folly, but to catch a glimpse of the girl who had unearthed a miracle. The Murrays, their future restored, were her first true customers, buying a small book of nursery rhymes for their child. Others followed, bringing not just their pennies for a book, but small tokens of gratitude. A warm meat pie, a bag of coal for her fire, a skillfully mended shutter for her window. The community that had once scorned her was now, piece by piece, rebuilding her home and her world. The bookshop was no longer Carstairs' folly. It was becoming a landmark of hope. Months passed. Autumn gave way to the hard frost of winter, and then melted into the tentative green of a Scottish spring. The bookshop on the close was transformed. The grime was gone from the windows, which now gleamed, inviting the light in. Inside, the chaotic mountains of books had been tamed into orderly, welcoming shelves. The air no longer smelled of decay, but of polished wood, old paper, and the faint, pleasant scent of binding glue. A fire crackled in the newly swept hearth, and a warm, gentle light from a gas lamp spilled out onto the cobbles, a beacon in the evening gloom. The shop was alive. It was breathing. Emily stood behind the counter, cataloging a new acquisition. She was no longer the pale, haunted girl who had arrived in the city. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her eyes, once clouded with grief, were clear and calm. Ink, now a well-fed and imperious ginger prince, lay sleeping on a neat stack of ledgers. The shop was not just surviving, it was thriving, a destination for scholars, students, and simple lovers of stories. She had used a small portion of her father's restored funds to make the shop sound and comfortable, but the rest she held in trust just as Mr. Carstairs had. The bell above the door chimed, and Mr. Abernathy, the old printer, stepped inside. He moved slowly, his body frail, but his eyes were bright. He did not look at Emily, but at the room itself. He took in the clean floors, the warm light, the neatly organized shelves. A slow, deep smile spread across his face. He walked over to the table where Emily kept a small, special collection. The 17 books that had held the town's salvation, their secret pages now empty. He ran a gnarled, ink-stained finger along the spine of the Scottish law book. "He knew you would come last, Mr. Abernathy said, his voice a soft rasp. "Sooner or later. He always said the shop would wait for someone who understood what was bound inside." Emily looked from his kind face to the books, then through the window to the life of the close beyond. She saw neighbors passing, who now nodded to her with genuine warmth and respect. She thought of Hugh's father, not of his ruin, but of his love for the tangible truth of a well-made book. In that quiet, golden moment, the full meaning of her journey settled upon her. She murmured, more to herself than to the old man, the simple, profound truth of her discovery. "It was never a bookshop I bought. It was a bank of promises." Thank you for joining us on this journey of quiet vindication. If this story of how patience can rewrite history and restore what was lost resonated with you, please consider leaving a like, a comment, or subscribing for more tales of hidden truths brought to light. We'll have another story for you soon.